Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Heather Ford. So Heather is coming all the way from the UK. And I love Heather's work because we also first became friends online, internet friends first. But she wrote a really amazing essay that I think everyone should read, and it's called The Missing Wikipedians. And I think she was one of the first people to really spark the conversation about who has authority to edit Wikipedia and how do we define authority? What are how do we measure authority, right? And so her work has really been pushing this question for the last 10 years. And she is also the co-founder of Creative Commons in South Africa. And she is also a web queen for many nonprofits. And you should also ask Heather about the time that she was in jail. But in the meantime, we are going to hear about place and Wikipedia.
You're not going to hear anything about that. Thank you so much, Trisha. By the way, I've totally changed my mind about what I wrote in the Missing Wikipedians. Yeah, you can do that, apparently. You can change it. But anyway, so the story I'm going to tell is on the 20th of November in 2011, I arrived in Nairobi. I was working before I went to Oxford for an organization called Ushahidi. And we were trying to figure out how to develop software to enable people who are usually geographically distant from one another to collaboratively curate stories, especially about big international news events like earthquakes and, small things like that. And so when I first arrived, I went to the supermarket and I bought every copy of the local newspaper. And it was actually a really big news day in Kenya at the time. So all of the newspapers ran these huge headlines about the invasion of southern Somalia. They all had these big pictures of tanks and guys with guns, and, the things that you see usually when people go to war. And so I went and looked at the Wikipedia page about this because I was curious about whether someone had actually created an article. And I was taken to an AFD. An AFD is an article for deletion where someone in the Wikipedia community can nominate an article for deletion. And the AFD was by an editor who was saying that this fails Wikipedia's notability requirements, and that the story was actually, it wasn't really an invasion, it was actually an incursion, and I quote, "This kind of thing happens in that part of the world all the time." Actually, I used to be really mad about Wikipedians, but now I feel quite differently because in the next few days, I became steeped in the narratives about this event, and I became steeped in them through watching television and through watching Twitter and Facebook and having conversations with people in bars and listening to people on the streets. And what I learned is that actually there are three key narratives about this event that people weren't really hearing, people outside of this physical location, and the three are. Basically, the first is that this is a story about the Kenyan military. For the first time since independence, the Kenyan military was involved in an active campaign. The whole of Kenya was watching the military because they used to make terrible jokes about them and say they were fat and lazy. Well, some people did, but not you, Mark. No.
I won't get into it.
We do have a real Kenyan in the room, so
yeah,
careful.
I know, it's terrible. I hate it when that happens. So. So the whole country was watching to see if they would actually succeed. The second was that this story was actually preempted by a whole bunch of really harrowing stories about foreigners and locals being kidnapped by the Al-Shabaab terrorist group that was what the military was trying to root out in southern Somalia. And actually, all this was happening in the east of Kenya, which is one of Kenya's major tourist destinations. So that's the second narrative. The third narrative is that there were actually real threats of retaliation by Al-Shabaab. They said this is basically Kenya at war with us and we're going to retaliate. I was sitting in a bar later that day and I heard, so I was talking to my friends and it was a Friday night and I said, oh my God, there's like no one here, wow, like I thought, you know, Nairobi is a hip and happening place. And they said to me, oh actually, everyone was told that they shouldn't go out and actually they shouldn't go out to bars. So I was thinking, yeah, I wonder why we're actually at a bar. And they were like, oh, you know, whatever. And actually later that night, there was a big bomb explosion, a retaliation attack, in which 2 or 3 people were killed. And this just happened like a mile from where we were. So what I realized when I was interviewing people, Wikipedians, about this and many other stories that are similar to this, is that there's actually these kinds of narratives are what Wikipedians outside of Kenya, and most of whom live in the US and Western Europe, don't actually hear. And that these narratives don't actually travel well. And they don't travel for 3 reasons. I like the number 3, as you might have guessed. The first is the volume of international news is declining, at least in the West. And this means that the story that the Western editors were getting was just a single story, the story that I told in the beginning, basically, about this incursion/invasion. And where there was gaps, people basically, you know, filled out those gaps by associating this with the war in Somalia, which was a big story that people kind of knew about and had been going on for a while. Thank you. The second is that much of the local media that Kenyans are actually exposed to, like the radio's really big, television, actually newspapers are increasing in Kenya. And of course, these stories on the streets were not accessible online, which is where Wikipedians mostly find their stories. And the third is that even when front pages of news, or even when, you know, these Kenyan websites did actually portray the news that was happening, websites are really bad actually at understanding how notable or important an event is in a national context. So, you know, on a headline, when I went to the supermarket, I saw 5 physical newspapers, all with really big headlines that looked different from the usual daily newspaper. But usually newspapers don't actually have those kinds of clues. So I don't think that all Wikipedians are bad, especially those who come from North America, which would be terrible because you guys mostly do. But it basically made me realize that for Wikipedians, it's actually really important for them to expose themselves to social media, because social media is actually the place where people highlight these background contextual stories, and that Wikipedia is generally really against using social media sources, but actually as a background to these kinds of narratives are really important for us to try and get a sense of what local notability actually is. Because we can't really have this case where, as one of the people contributing to the AFD discussion said, Wikipedia is not just for Americans, or Wikipedia is not for Americans only. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.